Hi, you're listening or maybe watching Music Club, or it could be TV Club, or it's some kind of weird mixture of the two. For the next 60 minutes, we're going to be talking about the Beatles Get Back, so you don't have to. Hi, I'm Simon.
I'm John, otherwise known as the War JR.
And I'm still Matt.
And we've just finished. How many hours is it in total? It's each 3 episodes of what, 2.5 hours each of the Beatles Get Back that's just appeared on Disney Plus.
Near 8 hours.
Which isn't, as you said before, we were chatting just before we started recording, is not out of the ordinary for Peter Jackson. I mean, except usually you have to pay for an expensive box set to watch that sort of length.
God, and the popcorn and.
Do you mean that there might be a director's cut coming at some point? On
the extended version.
Yeah. Oh my God.
That would be 60 hours, wouldn't it? That's the full runtime of footage that they've edited this down. I mean, it is something else in that respect, isn't it?
It'll be like Mark Lewison biography. You know, it's an epic in its own right, but then there's the extended version, which is just a breeze block.
Yeah. Before we go anywhere, I think, John, maybe we should talk about you, Jon Arnold. How should people know you?
If they know me at all, it's generally from my work on the Black Archives. I've done four of them for my sins.
Obviously, Matt, how does that make you feel? Matt, you considering the mileage you've got out of doing one of them, how does that make you feel?
I took a lot of care and time over doing one Black Archive.
What are you trying
to...
Are you inferring that John's work is watered down?
No, I'm suggesting that he's a much more prolific writer than I am. And he has more ideas than I am. I put my idea in a Black Archive, and now I'm waiting for my second idea to crop up.
Oh, the Witchfinders is there, surely.
I've sort of so I've earmarked the Witchfinders, but I can't just keep writing about the occult and witches unless I've got an angle, and I need time to do it. And I've lost the university library, and I really liked having the university library there to support the writing process. So at the moment, I'm writing little essays here and there for people, all almost exactly the same as the Demons work.
It's class. It's quality over quantity is the way I like to look at it.
Size doesn't matter.
Listen, guys, we're here to talk about the Beatles Get Back. I mean, what inspired me to ask you both, if I actually talking about it, was a little Twitter conversation. I think you were talking about it on Twitter, weren't you, John?
Yeah.
And I've been blown away. Maybe I shouldn't be surprised by how many people have watched this and have really reacted quite strongly and quite passionately about it, I think. So is this something you knew about before it appeared, or was this a complete surprise to you?
I'd heard about it before it appeared. I knew Peter Jackson was working on it, but I didn't know exactly when it was coming out. But I've been looking forward to it because obviously the original film, The Let It Be, does not have a good reputation at all, and it's got that reputation of seeing the Beatles as a unit on the verge of collapse, constantly arguing with each other. So I was looking forward to getting the full picture of it. Really,
it's interesting. I mean, each of us. I mean, what have the Beatles meant to you in your lifetime? Are they just a band? I mean, I think this is quite interesting. I think some people talk them just like another band. A lot of people will say they're overrated, or may not get the idea that they're anything special. But where do they fit into your life, Matt?
They're not overrated. For me, I think I was slow getting into music, so I got into music maybe 13, 14, 15 on cassette tapes. I worked in our local library in Andover Town Centre, and they loaned out cassette tapes, so I used to get a Beatles cassette every week out, and then I'd rip it onto a blank cassette and then listen to it walking to college and back every day. So I gradually got into every Beatles album in order. And every time I would get heavily into that particular album as I was walking. So they were probably the first music I really got into. So I skipped getting into music that was around me, the 80s and the early 90s. I sort of skipped all that and went straight to the Beatles, the Kinks, the Rolling Stones, then Jethro Tull and things like that. So the Beatles meant a lot to me. And I bought the book of lyrics. So there was a black book filled with the lyrics, and I basically learned all the lyrics out of this book because I couldn't play a musical instrument. So all I had was the sort of language of the Beatles. So it was really the kind of words and what they were saying that meant so much to me.
Mm-hmm. How about you, John?
I think I had a thing which is the same thing as a lot of people in my generation, a lot of people I know, where they were the part of my parents' record collection that I really gravitated to. So they're really a formative thing. It's when you're pulling out the old LPs, it was the cover of Revolver, because you just look at that when you're 5 and you just go, what the hell is this? And then you put that on, and it kind of tells the difference on my sister and me. I gravitated straight to Eleanor Rigby, and I always have, and I always will, which is probably kind of morbid for a 5-year-old, I think. Whereas my sister, she's on the flip side. She was straight for Yellow Submarine. She absolutely adored that. But they stopped collecting the Beatles records at Revolver, because I think I asked her in the late 80s, because they went a bit druggy at that point. Obviously, since then,
your parents did, or the Beatles?
No, they were never quite that.
Okay.
Not that they've ever told me anyway. They've only ever been to 2 concerts in their life. One of them was Gene Pitney, and one of them was Coldplay.
Wow.
The second one was free. But yeah, so yeah, it's like the first half of the Beatles' career was always there for me, and then when I could, late teens, could get my own albums, that's when I get CDs. This Pepper, Abbey Road, White Album, everything like that. So they're just a formative background thing for me, and yeah, I think it's impossible to overrate them. You can like other music more maybe, but look at what they brought into popular music in the 60s. They are the most influential band there has been, and probably, given the splintered landscape at the moment, that there ever will be.
Absolutely.
I think it's impossible to overrate them because they're not one single band. I mean, they're the same people, but they change so much over the course of a ridiculously short amount of time. So 8 or 9 years, that the stuff they're creating in 66 is so much different from 69, is so much different from 63, that to say you don't like the Beatles means you don't like a huge swathe of very different music.
You usually find, without saying too much, you usually find the people who do say that it's overrated. I mean, I said that just as to cover all bases, that there will be people who maybe listen to this who who just don't get it, and I understand that. But as you say, Matt, such a broad spectrum of sound, and what they did, regardless whether you like the music, I don't think you can take away from the effort and the imagination they showed to push things in different directions. I mean, we'll come on to this when we say about this film, because I think it's a fantastic example in a way that I don't think we've ever experienced before of quite how they operated. It's something else. For me, the Beatles were always there. I think I got into the Beatles through the BBC seasons of showing the Beatles movies. Every now and again, they would show all of the Beatles films in order. And funnily enough, I used to run out of steam at Let It Be. That for me was the beardy weirdy time. And here's me going through my own beardy time, But so I would watch Hard Day's Night. Not so much. Help was the film that I really loved. And it kind of occupied the same space as the Monkees TV series as well, for obvious reasons. And Yellow Submarine, of course.
Oh, so when you're young, that is absolutely perfect film. I remember it showed at Christmas a few times, and I was just in love with it.
It was there. It's one of those films that you waited to appear on TV alongside Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, and the Phantom Toll booth and things like that. It's
Yeah,
that whole idea of real people becoming cartoons
yeah,
was just amazing.
Yeah, it's
Yeah,
just
yeah.
fantastic.
But we didn't actually have any Beatles records at home apart from those kind of K-Tel covers. We used to, there was literally a band called the Rip-Offs who did albums of Beatles songs that sounded very similar to the originals. And I eventually got one of those for a birthday. So I never actually owned a Beatles record until I was in my teens and had my own money. And even then, I think I was loaned a cassette of Sergeant Pepper's by a friend who, a place where I was working during the summer. So it was quite a late, as far as actually finding out exactly what they did, I was quite late. But they were always there. There was always songs on Junior Choice, to the point where there were songs, Obla Di Obla Da. I had no idea it was a Beatles song until years later, but I knew it through Junior Choice. So that hackneyed phrase of them being part of your musical landscape when you're growing up is totally true. You can be into the Beatles and not even realize it if you, I suppose, if you were of a certain age, certainly growing up through the 70s. So yeah, I think we're all sold on the Beatles before we get here. But as far as this film's concerned, I mean, I saw reports that it was coming out and was waiting to see. But the first thing that struck me was the quality of the images. I mean, when they say that you watch these films and they look like they were filmed yesterday, but that's exactly the case, isn't it? How did you find it, Matt?
Oh, so I think I heard about it. I must have known before, but when we saw that the first, I think Peter Jackson kindly released a sort of clip during lockdown to show what he's been working on, and so I saw it then. I didn't know the film that much, the Let It Be film. I've got a copy, but it's really sort of ropey and grainy, and like John said, it's quite a downbeat film. So I don't think I've ever actually sat through the whole of Let It Be. But I am a fan of the Beatles' beardy weirdy phase. So for me, the Beatles get better as they go along and possibly reach a peak just before this, but they're certainly plateauing here. So yeah, I kind of found out about it when Peter Jackson released that first clip, and then I got progressively more excited, certainly with the trailer as well. The fact that the trailer alone was showing bits of the mythology kind of punctured. So the sort of the lightness of what was going on at the time rather than the darkness that came across in the trailer, so you kind of knew what you were going, or you could start to anticipate what you were going to get, and I think that's when I started getting very excited for it.
I mean, you say about this this dark story. As I say, I've never watched Let It Be all the way through, because as a child it felt very alien compared to what I'd come to love from the Beatles, the humorous side of things. But certainly the first part of this film, I found really quite hard going and quite heart wrenching, particularly with what Paul McCartney seems to be going through. How did you find that, John?
Yeah, absolutely. Because the thing you've got with Jackson's storytelling here, it starts off with that montage, and I think that montage, you maybe, if you're interested in the Beatles, go, why is a montage there? Because if you're not already interested, you're not likely to be watching it. But what that really effectively does, obviously, apart from telling Beatles history, it establishes that kind of background, which is that Brian Epstein's missing. You haven't got a manager, and Paul McCartney's having to take over. He's almost having to be this driving force, trying to be. He's trying to coax. John had a heroin habit at this point. George isn't particularly happy, and Paul McCartney's trying to coax them into almost working. I think, as John later says, it's office hours, and he's just trying to coax and cajole them along. And you can see he wants to be one of the guys, but he's having to play this managerial role as well, and it's kind of tearing him in half, I think, all the way through it. And it climaxes towards the end where John's being quite cutting towards George. He's rejected a few songs there. I think it's is it I Me Mine that he just almost dismisses. And so you can't almost blame George for walking out at the end. And we know the story that he didn't break up, but we know George left. So, but it's a really good cliffhanger in that. And there's this kind of peak just a couple of minutes into episode 2 where it's just, and then there were 2, and you could almost see McCartney breaking down a bit. But yeah, because the way I did it is I watched the first one and I couldn't do any more. So I came back after, I could watch the second 2 parts back to back, but that first one, it's you can see where Michael Lindsay Hogg kind of has that narrative of the band breaking down, but Peter Jackson just has the room for this fuller picture of it not quite being like that.
Do you think there's an argument for saying that the director was looking for his headline, that's why he focused on that side of things? Or
again, there's a line in part 3, I think it's almost about halfway through, where Michael Lindsay Hogg says they haven't got a story there yet, and you're going, yes, you have, if you're looking.
Sorry.
Yeah, go on.
It's odd because he wouldn't know that they had a story. So what struck me about this is what he presented was the first act of the 3-act story, which was the Twickenham stuff, which was the negative stuff. So it was the story of the Beatles breakup that he presented. But actually, what Peter Jackson reveals is this isn't about the Beatles breakup. This is about a triumph. This is about the last great hurrah of the Beatles, and the breakup happens after that. So when Michael Lindsay Hogg's talking about in the Apple recording studio about them not having a story, he doesn't know that they're going to break up the next year. So it's kind of, if he knew that, then he'd see that he does have a story. This is the breakup story. This is the kind of the last gasp of the Beatles.
Yeah, and I think what Peter Jackson quite effectively does is there's those little bits off where Alan Klein's just lurking off screen, and what really comes up for me is John is a terrible judge of personality in this. The Magic Alex stuff, and and then Alan Klein just lurking off stage, and you see Glyn John trying to warn him about it, but you can see it, and you always just want to reach in and go, don't do it, but
you have a similar thing with Paul McCartney, and I can't remember what the name of the guy they're selling all their records to, all their releases to.
It's Dick James, I think, isn't it?
Yeah, who's also a similarly shady character.
Yeah, absolutely.
By all accounts.
It's literally a case of watching. Oh, the suits are here again. That's how it feels. I mean, I'm not too sure how I feel about the director, Michael Lindsay Hogg, at all. I felt like he felt very much like the guy on the outside who doesn't quite get it. And I'm not quite sure that he was the man for the job, if I'm honest with you. That's my gut reaction to his presence and some of the stuff he was coming out with.
God, the stuff in went in Twickenham when he's just going, we'll go to Tripoli. There's be 2,000 Arabs and all this.
My latent Doctor Who fan in me just sees Michael Grade. I think it's possibly the cigar that does it. But I just can't not think of Michael Grade slowly winding the series down.
I mean, you know the rumor about him being, I think Gloria Vanderbilt told me he was Orson Welles' love child, and you can see Pete Jackson's almost trying to frame that early on with the cigar and the imagery on it.
I'm not actually sure what he was doing in any of it, if I'm honest with you, but who knows? I think the big thing from it, though, is to see the Beatles being human beings.
Absolutely.
And obviously the big thing, I'm trying to remember, there's an amazing podcast by some American ladies where they've analysed the Beatles' career, but they spend most of the time myth busting about this idea that John Lennon was the creative one, Paul McCartney was the one who wrote nice melodies, and John was the one who always pulled it in other directions, when quite blatantly, this isn't the case. This isn't the case, and you see this, that Paul McCartney, quite literally a creative powerhouse, pulling this thing along.
It's that one moment everyone kind of, I've seen content has gone about where, it's, we need something, Paul McCartney starts drumming, 15 seconds later, Get Back is there. Just the,
Yeah, that is quite the moment in the whole thing. I think that's the moment where it's like, we're actually watching this happen.
Is that the moment where Peter Jackson puts a caption on saying, "This is the moment where Get Back is created"?
But yeah,
that was powerful. That was good. But I've been on a bit of journey with John Lennon, because John Lennon always used to be my favourite. When I was listening to the Beatles, I had that perception that there were John Lennon songs and Paul McCartney songs, and the John Lennon songs always had the edge and the excitement. Then as I got to know more about John Lennon and see more interviews with him, I just thought he was a bit of a prick, and he really irritated me, and that kind of theatricality and that kind of arrogance just got on my nerves. But actually in this film he has that still, but he has this kind of vulnerability, and he's young. They're all so young. But that really came across.
What's really interesting, and I don't know to what degree they ever did this, but to see them, it does feel like almost like they're playing out their own retrospective when they're playing some of the older songs and then playing them in different styles, which is again these little gems.
And they do comic style as well, aren't they? Just putting on the accents and
but it kind of feels like you forget that this is a very short period of time between 63 and 69. Very, in anyone's life, that's a very short period of time. For them, this stuff has virtually happened yesterday, but for us, it's this extrapolated, sort of condensed and dense career of all this material, and we think about it as being a whole career of a band. For them, it's 5-6 years out of their life. I mean, within the public eye, anyway.
I mean, it's partly the move from black and white to color as well. That our perception of the Hamburg days being this kind of, the Hamburg days look like it's in the 1950s, sort of kind of grim and grainy and just post-war, and then 69 is like pretty much in the 70s. It's the end of the long, or beginning of the long 60s, so it's kind of colourful. But I guess for them, they're being really nostalgic about something that didn't happen that long ago. But at the same time, their lives between 1961 and 1969 had more events packed into them than most of our lives do in 40 years or 30 years. So it probably is the journey, the kind of the complex and emotional journey they've been on in that time. It probably was like looking back 20 years to a simpler time when people didn't know who they were.
Mm-hmm.
But they were still young. I mean, that's the thing about John Lennon and George Harrison as well. George Harrison, so the breakup moment, obviously the myth was the big bust up and them upsetting George Harrison and him walking off. But it's kind of clear that he kind of talks himself into walking off, because he doesn't feel like he can give anything to the band that someone like Eric Clapton couldn't, apart from he'd probably be pro-vaccine if he was around today. But he feels this sort of inadequacy, like these two powerhouses, Lennon and McCartney, and Harrison is constantly trying to find his place in the band. So it's this sort of imposter syndrome that he's still got even in 1969, that is slowly driving him up the wall. And the other, Lennon and McCartney, but mostly McCartney in this time, I think they know this, and they're trying to find a way to kind of make him feel part of the band, make him feel comfortable as much as they can, whilst still maintaining their own kind of creative drives and their own sort of strive towards perfection.
Absolutely. I think the thing you got in the first episode was that they're still trying to use that humor as a kind of, the bonding mechanism in the band, but it's absolutely not helpful at that point. And it's kind of, you just get this kind of passive aggressive tension developing. It's not necessarily anyone's fault. It's just from, because we look back at this as history, it's just looking back at it and going, these are young lads, they don't necessarily understand how to deal with these things. And yeah, and that's how it comes across, because obviously they do try to work it out, but they're aware, again, what comes up, they are really sharp guys. They know the problem, they just don't know how to solve them generally.
And as you were saying, John, they've lost Brian Epstein, who was, I mean, he's not that old, but he was the kind of the adult figure who presumably could mediate between these personalities.
Yeah.
And instead of Brian Epstein, they're now surrounded by a good team of people, but they're all people that kind of, they're all nodders and yes men, pretty much.
And kind of the nearest you get to somebody who can take that place is George Martin. The whole thing pulls together when he turns up, and they go, "What do you think, George?" And he says, "Well, I think it's a good, you know," he makes things happen, and says, "Yeah, we can do this." And he's the, you know, that whole cliche of him being the fifth Beatle. But I mean, yeah, he's the other member who makes it work. I mean, you say about humour. I think, without steering too far away from the Beatles, I realised that in a great deal of the music I listen to, humour is a massive element. Even to bands like Radiohead or Talk Talk, who who are like godlike geniuses in my book, there's still a fair amount of humour that offsets the darker side of them, which again feeds into the whole John Lennon thing. How do you? I mean, for me, it's almost essential to get away from any band that takes themselves too seriously. There's that tipping point, isn't there?
It's almost because humour is very much an in-group thing. It's, if you laugh at people's jokes, you tend to like them. It takes kind of confidence when you're a band. You're trying to sell as many records as possible, or trying to be heard by as wide a range of people as possible. It's almost a scary thing to put your sense of humour on display. It's like, say, with Radiohead, they're kind of a very misunderstood band on that. But something like Karma Police, he said that's their idea of a comedy song. Father Ted has it as one of the most depressing songs of all time.
Yeah, totally. I mean, but this is something you really pick up on Get Back, isn't it? The humour is just, there's that difficult first part, but as they start to spend time with each other, and the amount of times that their way of rehearsing these songs, because these are brand new songs to the band, and they're learning them. We see them learning the songs, but they get through those rehearsals by taking the piss out of them, their own songs.
It looks like they're definitely trying to keep their interest up, and you do get the impression that this is a different way of working from what they're used to. So this is more kind of rehearsing for a live event that they don't know what it's going to be, and they're rehearsing songs that haven't been written yet, which is kind of nuts. But yeah, they're definitely kind of trying different ways to. It's almost like what I was amazed at is how they could keep track of all the things that were successful and weren't successful. I still can't quite see how they did it in these episodes, because you see Get Back, for instance, evolving into the song we know, or close to the song we know, because Phil Spector hasn't come along. But I can see how they make the jump from one to that, but how they keep track of saying, well, that bit in the middle, that 5 seconds in the middle, what you did worked. And I wonder if part of taking the piss, part of singing ridiculous lyrics, is to kind of say, well, the lyrics don't matter on this run through. We're just focused on this beat or the bass, and nobody ever seems to care about the drums. I heard like 2 comments in the whole 7 hours about, well, could you drum slightly lighter, please, Ringo? Ringo just sits in the back and just makes up his own stuff, and they just accept it. Ringo's probably the least kind of directed Beatle in this whole album, but it does feel to me like it's a very weird way of forming those songs for them, because they're all together suddenly. They're not like coming in at separate times and recording different bits and doing it over a very short period of time.
Yeah, what I'd guess with it is, the thing about Get Back, it's the it's the it's the glimpse into the artistic process. That's what it's just an 8-hour glimpse into how someone puts their art together, and that's I think that the silly voices, the goofing about, that's a way of almost dealing with you guys are writers and artists. You can't just turn up on the day and busk it. You have to put the work in somewhere down the line, and that's their way of kind of making the work a bit fun, a bit, so they're able to get through it generally.
I think it's a way of breeding familiarity with it as well, to the point where you do have to learn these songs so much that much like driving, you've got to get to the point where you're not actually consciously thinking about what you're doing. Those hands are going to where they need to be, so that familiarity gets into place, to the point where you get that the rooftop performance right at the end of the 3 episodes, where they're that familiar with the songs where they just, let's do this again, let's do that, and then they start mucking around on the hoof, and that way the invention and the songs are able to breathe in a way.
They mostly do that. John Lennon is a bit sketchy on some of his stuff, and when the police turn up, they quite rightly distracted.
Yeah,
and he just slips entirely into a different key for a bit, and then they get back to it.
Paul McCartney's giggling through most of Get Back, isn't he? In that last time they play it.
I love Macca's face when he clocks the police coming onto the roof. There's an extra bit of swagger there, a grin on the face. He loves. This is what he's wanted all along.
Yeah,
but we know this is absolutely what they wanted all along, because they'd already said, "Wouldn't it be great if the police came along and arrested us at some point?" That was before they even had the idea to go up on the roof.
Yeah.
So yeah,
there's that old thing about people say about the Sex Pistols and the Clash. Without trying to change the subject too much, but it's something that's always occurred to me. And of course, most people seem to say the Sex Pistols are the Beatles and the Clash for the Rolling Stones. I think it's the other way around. I really do. Or at least I certainly think, I'm wording myself strangely here, but I do think that if there's any one band that came along after the Beatles that were anywhere near them with the same amount of invention and fresh spirit, I think it's the Clash. And I don't know why I think of that because of the police turning up and that sort of thing. You get the Sex Pistols where they would create these situations, or Malcolm McLaren would create these situations. Yeah, but actually, the Clash were doing it naturally.
Oddly, you're skipping Jethro Tull there. Clearly, my problem with I've always had a problem with the Sex Pistols because I'm a square. And to be honest, if the Sex Pistols got on top of a London roof, I'd be one of the guys in ties down at the bottom, saying to the police, "Actually, I'm just trying to work here. Could you please get them to turn the music on?" But I'm aware that there are fans of the Sex Pistols as well, and I respect their opinions.
Yeah, and I'll still say with the Sex Pistols, the Malcolm McLaren is kind of very much in the Andrew Loog Oldham mode. He wants to get the attention to the band because the Stones maybe aren't quite as inventive as their rivals here,
I suppose the difference, though, we're going back to these suits, the suits that were hanging around the Beatles during this film, and the director as well, that they almost want to bottle whatever it is that the Beatles have got. They're trying to bottle it, but manufacture these situations. But actually, the Beatles kind of self-generate this stuff just through bits and pieces. They say the sort of thing that John Lennon might come out with, the classic "bigger than Jesus" comment and things like that. It was a completely offhand comment that got pounced upon.
Oh God! And he was trying for it again. Which I think there's a headline in the 3rd episode that's, "I love Yoko more than the Queen" or something like that.
Yeah. Interesting. Touching on that subject, how did you feel about the involvement of families? I mean, obviously, again, people have had very fixed ideas of how Yoko affected the dynamic of the band. And maybe with Linda as well, with outside influences coming towards the band, and whether they had any impact on the future of the band.
Yeah, there's a question from, I think, Michael Lindsay Hogg there about, are you as close to John as you used to be? And McCartney really answers that well, because he said, we used to be together in each other's pockets. We were in hotel rooms, we were waking up at the same time, we were staring at the same walls, all that. And he said, obviously, with relationships, when they're not going to be that close anymore. But it's not, it's not Yoko or Linda or it's Mo Starkey and Olivia at this point. They're all about that, and they are not at all responsible for any kind of tension, really. You see in the third, there's that Paul and John have the freak jam with Yoko there. They have fun with it as well.
Yeah.
She's part of she's part of the family as much as Paul bringing his kids in is. They are. It's a unit. It's it's people who work together. They know each other. They love each other. Yoko has been stereotyped a hell of a lot over the years, as obviously with the woman who broke up the Beatles, and there probably are less savoury elements to that. But I think Michael Lindsay Hogg's original film is a lot to blame for that, and it's kind of nice to have that myth busted.
It seems that, if anything, the Beatles are so wealthy at this point. They've all got massive houses. They've all got their own recording studios. And if you've got your own recording studios, that's where you want to be. And if you look at the Imagine documentary, which presumably is the next step along, certainly for John Lennon after this, is Imagine, where you see him with George Harrison, and he's filming it in his own home studio. And a lot of what Get Back reveals is what we kind of already knew, that the recording environment was important to them, that Twickenham was definitely a problem because it was cold, big, empty and awkward and unnatural. They're happier when they get to the Apple studios, but at the same time, they're all coming from their homes in the stockbroker belt, where they've got recording studios where they're living. So they could all just be recording independently in a much more comfortable place with their families around them. So of course they're going to be more distant at this point because they don't have to have that kind of shared facility anymore. It's kind of an artificial place for them to come and record an album by now.
Yeah, and I think part of the point of the session was for them to be all in the room playing together, because obviously for the past couple of albums they've developed the studio as the instrument. They're all playing separately. It's not necessarily bouncing off each other. So
You have to excuse me. I was trying to look up. Sorry, I completely lost the momentum there. I was trying to look up this podcast, but when you're talking, I will keep looking for this amazing podcast where they literally go into every little detail of and a lot of this that we're talking about, with the relationship with the wives and the families is picked up on, and they do their homework properly, and this film completely justifies a lot of the theories they come up with, which is really great. I'll find the title as and when I can, and see if we can put it in the notes for this episode.
And the other thing that was interesting, so you talked about George Martin coming along at the Apple Studios and him being this kind of mediating sort of older presence, but also and the fifth Beatle, Billy Preston coming along does kind of the opposite, but with the same effect. So he comes along and he's a complete stranger, or not a complete stranger, but pretty much a stranger. But he's kind of tying the songs together, and at that point you can see them getting a little bit more into what they're doing, and they're fired up a bit more. And that's another sort of turning point, I think, in the whole story, which we kind of knew about.
It's because they're trying to bring, Billy Preston is that kind of new element at this point, isn't it? They think they need, because they are looking for something new to boost them from where they have been.
And it's frustrating because, and I saw this, there have been sort of interviews with Peter Jackson where he's talked about his conversations with McCartney and Ringo Starr, and one of the frustrations was there are conversations that McCartney wasn't privy to. So the conversation between George Harrison and John Lennon, where George Harrison is saying, my dream in the future is to record my own albums, but also come back to the Beatles and record them and sort of move one into the other. And John Lennon's positive about that. Paul McCartney didn't know that conversation had taken place, and has now said if he knew that conversation had taken place, then that's a potential future for the Beatles. And actually this whole documentary, you see these conversations where you think, actually, that could be the future for the Beatles. This is what the Beatles could be like in the 70s, with guest artists coming in to just give them a lift, with sort of engineered recording sessions, or going to one of their houses each time just to get together. It's obvious that they're enjoying being together for a change and recording. But for business reasons, the schism, once they've finished, I mean, and again, McCartney's right. Once they've done the rooftop concert, once they've got the albums recorded, then they don't tour. So what is there? What is there left? They just record another album, or they go their separate ways. They go on holiday. Ringo goes into a film, and then they just break up again. And that's when the business schisms start happening, because they have sort of independent, they have conversations with their solicitors or between their solicitors, and it becomes a legal argument rather than an argument of personalities. It's just frustrating. The Beatles could have continued to be creative through the 1970s. And I think, given the amount they changed in 8 years in the 60s, I don't think they would have stayed static. I think they would have continued to evolve. I mean, they might have become god awful, and we might be talking about them differently. But
I think there's an assumption, isn't there? Particularly with John and Yoko, that somehow their relationship and how they wanted to live life was mutually exclusive to being in the Beatles, and that isn't the case at all. You hear John Lennon saying, "I don't ever want there to be a point where I'm not a Beatle." I think he says words to that effect. I'm probably misquoting that slightly, but that was, of all the members, he was the one that said that. But it's really interesting, the situation with George Harrison, this idea that he, the imposter syndrome, that he didn't feel he was up to it. And there's mention of Eric Clapton, literally saying to them, "I feel like you should get Eric Clapton in here." I'm thinking to myself, no, please don't. And but all the way through there's at no point do you sort of think to yourself, God, they're all incredible musicians. What they do is perfect. And the hackneyed thing of Ringo not being a very good drummer. I mean, he's not, he's not Vinnie Colaiuta or anyone like that. But what he does, the judgment he has in these things, is just, well, he's a drummer, I know, but it's note perfect. I think it's the only phrase I can think of. And all of them, Paul McCartney's adept, and he kind of understands and feels music in a way that is really quite unique.
I think that's sorry.
Yeah, well, all I was going to say was that none of these are exemplary musicians, but what they do have is judgment and gut instinct, and I think that is what is overlooked with the Beatles, I suppose, is that they say about the songs that they write, but it's like they're in a big playroom. It's like this big sandpit, and they just, when you see the way they play instruments in a way that they've not done before, and they don't judge themselves by anyone else. And I think, again, another thing I've heard people saying about the Beatles is that they were lucky in as much as they were there at the right time to think of all these things and be the ones who did all of this. But you had to be them in order to do it. That's what's strange. And I still don't quite understand why certain bands, you may get bands like the Flaming Lips or someone like that, where they're still pushing the boundaries and they're still having a load of fun with music and not framing things in the way that everyone else does. I mean, I get fed up with bands where, a drum sounds like a drum, or, this is the way a bass should sound. And there are fixed genres and things should sound a certain way. When there are no rules, as far as art's concerned, you can do whatever you like, and a guitar doesn't have to sound like a guitar.
Yeah,
I don't know. I'm on my soapbox now, but
Yes. The thing, I mean, I love the Flaming Lips as much as anyone on this planet. But the thing with McCartney is he goes to these avant-garde do as much as Lennon does, but he's also got he's played at his dad's piano. He can kind of translate this avant-garde into something massively popular. We said they were using Stravinsky strings on Eleanor Rigby, and that invented the way strings are used in pop music. That's that kind of thing.
And what interested me is what we saw on film. So what excited me about that Get Back moment when the song just develops is we don't see that a lot in this documentary, because most of those moments take place when the Beatles are at home or McCartney's at home in the shower or in the bath or in bed, and he comes up and they come in with this idea. So for most of these songs, it's like they're magic. They've been created out of nothing. Magically, they're sort of half formed already, and then they take forms, and then it becomes a kind of a mechanical process. That's a bit reductive, but it's a sort of a mechanical process of taking this idea and turning it into a song that works. But it's that creation, that kind of initial idea for a song. I think they are, they are all 3 or 4 of them. Like Ringo Starr has his moments. They're geniuses to come up with these different ideas, but that genius happens, I think, away from the cameras mostly. So we see the birth of Octopus's Garden here.
Yeah, I was thinking about that as you were saying that.
That is such a sweet moment that actually makes me like Ringo. I'm not a fan of a lot of Ringo Starr's songs, but seeing the way that sort of works with George Harrison, he works with George Harrison to kind of develop that song and to sort of shape it more into a song that will actually go somewhere. That was such a sweet moment.
I mean, George Harrison he looks amazing. He comes out of these films in a much stronger position. It's really funny that he says about this idea that, if he does his own album, he wants to hear all of his songs all together in the form of an album, so he kind of gets an idea of who he is in some respects. I know that he always had regrets that the Beatles stopped him from becoming what he would call a proper guitarist, which I think is a real shame. It's more than a shame. I think it's a tragedy in some respects that he didn't, and maybe wasn't appreciated. But there's what I will say in Paul McCartney's, not defense, but to kind of boost him up, is, as you say, Matt, they're a very young age, but there's a conversation that's had where essentially Paul McCartney's saying, he's talking about self-care, which brings us right up to date with where we are, where we talk about things, that he was talking about them looking after each other and looking after their mental health. There's a conversation, isn't there? There's a taped recording, a covert recording of them in a cafe, isn't there, where they've hidden a microphone?
It's Lennon and McCartney, yeah. They hid a microphone in the flower display in the middle.
But they're essentially talking about looking after George and saying, we need to look out for him, that we haven't looked out for him, and therefore this is where we are, that he's walked out because he feels unappreciated, he feels very down on himself, and yet nobody thinks badly of him. And yet the standard of the work that he comes out with in these 3 episodes. I mean, I was listening to is it Old Brown Shoe? Is that what it's called, the song?
Yeah.
Which I don't know, that I should know better, but listening to it, how he comes up with that's an incredibly strong song. And some of those chords he's working with are just, his mind goes to places somewhat, you say about Lennon and McCartney, but George Harrison takes you to places you've never been to. You're in a different world when you're listening to a George Harrison song.
And I think that comes later. So another frustration is George Harrison starts to be given more opportunities, certainly along here. And again, if you watch Imagine, so John Lennon's the one that gets Ringo in and gets George Harrison in. So watching the Imagine documentary, it's pretty much this. It's pretty much the Beatles playing, just without Paul McCartney. And that's one of the depressing things, is there's no reason for it. And actually George Harrison is starting to get what he wants here and what he needs and what he deserves here. And it just took the Beatles breaking up to really give him everything he wanted.
Yeah, because so All Things Must Pass comes out in 1970. So he was, what he says in the documentary is true. He had that huge pile of songs ready to go. And it's phenomenal that someone can come out, the most successful band in the world, and just come out with such a complete artistic work straight off that bat.
The other surprising thing is how much Paul McCartney had to do with all of these John Lennon solo songs. So I think, is it Give Me Some Truth? That it turns out that Paul McCartney helped John Lennon write. And then later, Paul McCartney forgot that he'd helped John Lennon write this song and sort of denied that he'd had anything to do with it. And then again was shown by Peter Jackson the clip of him sitting there helping John Lennon write it. And he's like, oh, really? Did I? Oh, it was a good song.
Oh, God, you got Jealous Guy at the end as well, haven't you?
Yeah.
Amazing. How do we feel Peter Jackson comes out of this? Because I know JR is a massive fan of Peter Jackson, so I'm sure he wants us to talk about that.
Was that sarcasm?
I tried to hide it. I thought I did.
I think Jackson comes across really well because I think his storytelling instincts on this are absolutely immaculate. You know, as I said before, there's that montage at the start which just sets everything up, which kind of quietly sets up that Epstein as a ghost, Epstein's ghost at the feast, and you know the episode structure. There's a cliffhanger on episode 1. George walks out, so it's a natural thing. Again, episode 2 is a natural cliffhanger. They're about to go for the rooftop gig, and the third just working up to the rooftop gig. So I think he's really structured it very, very nicely.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that I was gripped. So I was more, to be honest, more gripped by this than I was by Edgar Wright Sparks' documentary, and I liked Edgar Wright Sparks' documentary.
Yeah.
But this is about 8 times the length, and they play Get Back maybe 9, 10, 11, 12 times in this, and I didn't lose interest. And I think part of that is my interest in the subject, but part of it is the way it's been edited together, the way that the captions work to contextualize things, the way he ties in. You see Linda McCartney taking photographs, and then you see the photograph that Linda McCartney's just taken, and everything's sort of bedded in to these moments. And the way he's restored and he's matched footage, it's almost like a loose cannons reconstruction. That he's kind of, some images don't quite belong with the conversation, because he admits that there's a caption at the beginning that sometimes the conversation's been matched to stuff that looks a bit like the conversation should go there, but it works perfectly. You kind of forget that halfway through. And and I think that's all down to Peter Jackson. That's all down to his skill. That's all down to, and also his care and attention. And also, if he wasn't a fan, if it wasn't for Peter Jackson, the Beatles, McCartney and Ringo Starr wouldn't have let him do this. He had to persuade them to release this footage, and to let him edit it. And he knew exactly what to tell them in order to convince them, because they'd kind of bought into this mythology that this was the Beatles breaking up, that this was a depressing period full of like angst and infighting. And it took Peter Jackson to review all of this footage and say to them, actually, this is really positive stuff. You guys are having fun here, and here. Look at this clip of Ringo Starr farting and then declaring it. Isn't that a great moment? And they go, yeah, maybe it is.
Or farted.
Yeah. Edit it and let's see. And that's entirely down to Peter Jackson. So I think he's extraordinary. All we can do is hope that we can channel his Doctor Who fandom into recreating all the lost 1960s stories in some kind of Andy Serkis mocap, which I'm only half convinced that he wouldn't do. I mean, he's a massive Doctor Who fan. There must have been something crossing his mind that he would do something with Doctor Who, because I would if I had his money and his like resources.
Ed Wetter, yeah. Listen, we're heading up on our hour, so can you think of a particular moment or a facet of this that you're taking? Because I think we're all thinking very positively about it, that it's been a positive experience. What one thing are you taking away from this, John?
I'd kind of go, and it's again, it may be fixed by the structure, but the sheer joy they're taking in just playing live again, that rooftop gig, it's that fuller picture that we're getting, that you get all the way through. You know, I'd take Mal Evans is absolute, it's almost childlike happiness at being with the Beatles. So can we get me an anvil? Here's an anvil halfway after lunch. And it's the little characters. It's the tapestry you're getting of the life there. So you get Peter Sellers dropping in. It's the families, as you said. It's just you're getting. We're essentially watching an extended people at work thing, and this should be terrible, but it's wonderful. It puts the wonder into Let It Be that perhaps the album and the original film don't get.
Mm-hmm. Matt, what about you?
Yeah, I thought the rooftop concert was definitely the way it was cut together, and you see the kind of the jeopardy and the police build up and all of that footage. But for me, it's actually the downbeat moments that got to me, particularly that what John was saying, Paul McCartney's moment where he's asked, what do you think of John and Yoko, and do you think that spending less time, and he kind of gets close to tears, that he kind of realizes that at some point the Beatles will break up and he'll be on his own. And that moment, I mean, everybody comes off well in this documentary, even the suits, even the sort of the yes men come off quite well, but the Beatles in particular, they're all kind of gone up in my estimations from this. So yeah, it was that got to me.
Mm-hmm. For me, it was quite a profound moment where I thought about the passage of time and about how the fact that the Beatles existed, that you had four people of this. I hate the word talent because I don't necessarily believe in it, because I always feel it's more about judgment maybe than talent, because I think anyone can really train themselves up if they practice hard enough to do a lot of this stuff. But equally, people with these skills, that they all happen to be in the same place at the same time to create this music. We didn't just have John Lennon and Paul McCartney, we had George Harrison as well, and and Ringo with that the backbeat of the whole thing, and his personality shining through. And the thing is, that's one miracle, and that's probably the great miracle. But also, when you get a band that works, for anyone who's been in a band, it's always miraculous when a band works well enough that you stay together for a few years and that you stay friends. That's a miracle in itself, because it is a relationship on multi levels. Where it's they say that marriage is hard, but you try being in a band, and that's another thing as well. So it's any wonder. Yeah, podcasts. Yeah, being in a podcast is like being in a band. I know full well, and it's an equation. Two people is an equation, and then try put three or four people into an equation, it becomes even more complicated. And sometimes, like you say, you get these moments where you have an incredible time, and so in the bad times you forget those good times. But when those times are good, and when you're firing off, as we see in this film, when they get to that point where they get relaxed with each other and forget all the insecurities that were going on in their heads when they weren't together, and then it takes a bit of time for them to re-engage and be, there's that point where Paul McCartney and John Lennon are dancing in the recording studio when they're playing back their tapes.
Oh, and you think John and Yoko dancing as well in that, towards the end of part one, where amongst all the past progression, it's gorgeous.
Yeah. It is a wonderful thing. We'd like to, JR likes us to give these scores, so they think you can give the film scores. So
we're allowed to give them half points, aren't we?
Are we? Oh, okay, yeah. Go on then, Matt.
Well, I'll give it a 10, because for me, I want to think of this as a film because it's one of my films of the year. So there's nothing I find it really difficult to give it anything less than a 10, because I can't think of how it would be done differently. As a documentary, it kept my attention. Because 8 hours, that's an extraordinary length of time for, as John said, basically a men at work documentary, but it works perfectly. So there's nothing that can be changed. And all it's done is sort of bolstered my enjoyment of the Beatles and my regard for the individuals that were there, and it's encouraged me to try and find out more about the period again and get some more biographies.
John?
Yeah, I think I've got to go with 10 as well, because I don't see, obviously if you're giving a 10, you're going, were there any flaws there? And I'm just going, I don't see how you could have done it differently to give that extra picture. And after that, I just went straight back to Abbey Road and back to Let It Be. And I know Phil Spector's on there, and you can have Let It Be Naked or whatever. But it sent me back to the music. And I wasn't a huge fan of Get Back, the song, before this. I know it's been part of the tapestry of life for however long. But you hear it, it gives you fresh ears on that, and I think that's almost a miracle after all this time, through all familiarity.
Yeah, it's got to be a 10. It's got to be a 10 because I suppose part of the job of a director or somebody editing together a film like this is to allow the viewer to not be aware that it's being edited, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So you just take it in and watch it, and then you take the effort out of it. The other option is to watch the 60 hours of footage yourself.
I mean, what could he have edited out? I mean, it flows so smoothly that you get the feeling that you are watching I know you're not watching like a whole day's footage for each day, but my God, they must have filmed like John Lennon just going to the lavatory, or what did they cut out? I mean, this is the thing.
Yeah. Feel there's a major point missing in there, do you? You feel like you've all everything.
Yeah. Well, so I think it was an overly positive experience, really. I don't think we can say any more than that. So thanks for watching, if you're watching. Thanks for listening, if you're listening. And
what are we talking about next week, Simon?
What are we talking about next?
Once again, I would say
this is where we appreciate JR's admin, because we have no idea where we are and when this is being released.
Don't have any young Jim Nichols of this podcast.
No, I've look, to give us some kind of time thing. I've worn my Christmas jumper today, so this is probably going to go straight out on YouTube. I think within 24 hours. That's the theory. So yeah. Anyway, right. Well, thanks for watching, listening, or whatever you're doing. I was Simon.
I was John.
I was Matt.
And we'll speak again soon.